It's that time of day. Can everyone just stand up for a second? Just yeah. Get those legs moving for a second. You don't need to shake and do everything. I don't want to see all that BO. All right, every third person, just sit down. Just work it out. About every third person, sit down. All right. You're going to die of diabetes-related conditions. Okay, another third of you sit down. You're going to die of cancer. Sorry, I don't want to put the vibe on you. The other third of you, sit down. You're all going to die of inflammatory-related diseases. Notice that I'm still standing, and I'm going to die of old age. I'm an orthopaedic surgeon, but I'm going to talk to you about what I think is the nutritional model of modern disease. I've been influenced by several people, a couple of them are here today, and Grant and I were involved in an interesting email exchange a few months ago where the penny dropped, and I'll explain that a little bit later. I've recently been recognised as having a nutritional recognition, at least by the American Society for Nutrition, so this is my first public announcement of that. So for all the people who say I've got no nutritional education, maybe I've got a little bit. My early years, I was a fat, pimply kid, struggled with my weight for 40 years, and I think it was related to my diet. I was raised on sugar, refined carbohydrate and margarine and polyunsaturated oils. 14 years ago, we met Pete Evans earlier today, that he has his rugged look. This was my rugged look 14 years ago. I had a tumour at the base of my brain, my vision was going. I ended up having a craniotomy, radiotherapy, so that's not much fun. I learned to walk again and went back to operating some months later, and I'm still operating despite the fact that I've had brain surgery, I've had a brain tumour. But because of that, I'm not responsible for anything I've said in the past. I'm not responsible for anything I say in the future. But I've been on the other side. I think that combination of sugar, refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils, and I'm saying three things. It's really hard to come away with one message, but I'm saying three things contribute. And in today's society, with the amount that we have, I think that the combination is toxic. So I'm proposing a model of modern disease here today, and to do that you need to make some observations. You've got to have a hypothesis, a mechanism, pathophysiology. And I'm going to try and dumb down what talk we just had from Kieran before. I'm always amazed. That's actually getting simpler, his talk, and I'm starting to understand it, but I'm an orthopaedic surgeon and I'm going to try and keep it fairly simple because we're fairly simple Neanderthal types. Then I'm going to talk about what evidence is around. So what observation have I made? Over time, we're getting fatter and sicker as a society, no question. Our rates of disease of virtually everything, and you can track it by MBS numbers, and I've done that on a few different topics, is getting worse. We've got more cancer, we've got more cardiovascular disease despite the statins, we've got more dementia, we've got more diabetes, more. Children's allergies on the increase, children's cancers on the increase. It's all going up. I think it's related to the modern fad diet. And that's been around for 40, 50 years, and it's based on convenience. It's about mass production. It's about driving down costs. It's about profitability. And yes, I do think it's a conspiracy theory. As we progress along, the big food industry is producing cheaper food for profit, and there's a greater recognition that that's actually playing a role with our health. What have they done? It's really simple. This isn't a bridge talk for you, but sugar is a preservative. You take fibre out of food, it lasts longer. And if you use polyunsaturated oils, that drives down cost. We no longer have truly natural food in the supermarket, it's manufactured. And along with that comes a cost to our health, as well as our personal situation. I've looked at this on quite a few economic factors. I've done a couple of papers on it. Only recently I've extrapolated some British data. We're spending approximately $1 million per hour on diabetes-related conditions in Australia. That's $17,000 per minute. So $1 million per hour, $17,000 per minute. So I've been going for 4 minutes. What's wrong? $68,000 I've just blown of your money, okay, watching diabetes-related conditions. I do my work in Vanuatu and I'm operating out there. Diabetes is out of control. Western disease has arrived there in the last 15 years since the introduction of modern food, or the Western diet. So, yeah, I think we're doomed. But we're all lemmings about to go over the edge of the cliff. The question is whether or not you want to listen to me and grab a parachute along the way. So that's my observation. Have I got a hypothesis that then backs this up? Well, my hypothesis is in fact based around the concept of inflammation. Now, this is a given. If you look at it, inflammation is at the basis of every single condition, whether or not it is cancer, diabetes, I'm just getting a bit louder there, cardiovascular disease, dementia, obesity, allergy. Every single condition has inflammation at the basis of it. So let's actually think, my hypothesis, what's toxic creates that inflammation. It's all interrelated. So I do think, if I get closer, is that better or worse? Sorry. Combination of sugar, refined carbohydrates, and polyunsaturated oils creates inflammation. That by itself creates inflammation in every cell of the body and every organ. That alone isn't all of that other stuff. So there are other influences, and I call that other stuff, and I'll come back to what I think is the other stuff. Z dwelled upon a little bit of it later. But ultimately you create a susceptible organ, and that susceptibility is then prone to further damage. Once you've got that damage on site, then you've got a chronic state of ill health. So that's my hypothesis. The mechanism, I try and keep it fairly simple as an orthopaedic surgeon, using lots of pictures. You know, we don't read books, we just look at picture books. So what are the culprits? Okay. Sugar. Sugar is half fructose and half glucose. That's it, simple as that. What's really interesting about fructose is it was really only definitively described its metabolism in 2010. That's only 4 years ago. We know a whole lot about glucose, but we've only just found out about fructose and its pathways. And so therefore, arguably every single bit of nutritional literature that's out there before 2012 is probably irrelevant, or of interest only, at least in my mind. Fructose comes in all forms: sugar, fruit, cane sugar, honey, maple syrup, and particularly high fructose corn syrup, and it's all manufactured. The other half of sugar is glucose. Glucose, and I think we just forgot, I could come back, I realised something today, we actually haven't described what food is. Food to me is actually, it's either carbohydrate, fat, or protein. That's all it is. You throw in a few minerals and vitamins and that equals food. So carbohydrate is effectively just glucose. We've sort of forgotten that today. We talk about glucose metabolism, carbohydrate, and for a lot of you who just get the chemistry right. So glucose comes in the form of bread, rice, pasta, potato and sugar. And if you look at the colour of all that, what colour is this? Well, it's not white, it's beige. It's really boring beige at the best. Remember that sugar's been lightened down or brightened. And polyunsaturated oils, that's my other culprit there. Whether or not it's margarine or vegetable oils, which actually don't really exist because they're mostly seed oils. They're polyunsaturated. Just to dwell upon the difference between a saturated fat and a polyunsaturated fat, or polyunsaturated oils. The difference between a fat and an oil is what state it is. Is it room temperature? So a fat is solid at room temperature and an oil is liquid. A fat is solid, and it's called saturated fat. The image on the left above the butter there is very solid. It's got no double bonds in it, no flexibility, and having no flexibility means it's got no points of weakness. Whereas a polyunsaturated oil, by definition, has lots of poly, meaning lots of, unsaturated means effectively here double bonds, and those double bonds give it flexibility. And a seed or a plant, where these things are based from, requires oil to move up and down it at cool temperatures, and when it does that, it survives. But it does that by actually having these points of flexibility. Unfortunately, those points of flexibility are points of weakness, and each one of those can be oxidised, and oxidation is rust, and oxidation is inflammation. So therefore, the more points of weakness you have in the oils in your body, the more likely it is to become inflamed. So that combination that we talk about is in fact, I think, inflammatory. The other stuff comes in, and the other stuff, and Z, again, I'll gloss over this, stress, genetics, chemicals, bowel organisms, got an enormous amount of work that's going to, I think, be found out about gut flora and its influence on our health in the next few years. Exercise, we had a bit of chat last night about the effects of latitude and longitude. The further south you go, the more multiple sclerosis there is. Anecdotally, I've had some fabulous stories given to me. N=1 studies of people with MS with massive improvements in recent times by going high fat. So I think that's the mechanism, but I'm going to try and simplify down the pathophysiology. So what's actually happening at the cellular level? So I'm giving the same talk as Kieran, somewhat apologies, but with more pictures. So glucose, which we know a fair amount about, is half of sugar, but it comes in the bread, the rice, the pasta, cereal, potato. It comes in different forms: maltose, dextrose, lactose. But it's all just glucose, or repeating molecules of glucose. And in summary, if you have glucose, anything more than 4 grams, which is 1 teaspoon, which is all that sits in the blood. So if you have more than 4 grams, 1 teaspoon of sugar, or 1 teaspoon of glucose, under the effect of insulin, that gets stored as fat. That's what the body wants to do with it. That insulin, as has been alluded to earlier today, has multiple effects in the body. But if you don't put glucose in, you actually don't need much in the way of insulin. But we do tend to have more than 4 grams of glucose in a meal, and particularly in a carbohydrate diet of 50 to 60%, which is the Australian recommendations, we're producing an enormous amount of fat. But one of my things that fascinate me is fructose and the metabolism of it. And again, I'm going to simplify that down. Fructose, half of sugar, very similar molecular structure to glucose, but is metabolised completely differently. And for the interest of today, it gets produced into LDL particles. They're colloquially known as the bad cholesterol. Okay, you've heard about good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. We're going to spend a lot, but let's just think about them as the bad little nasty LDL particles, just the wrong size to create trouble. And there's a complex metabolic pathway through the liver. That big brownish thing there is meant to be the liver. But if you stick sugar into it, then ultimately through de novo lipogenesis in the liver, that gets converted into the LDL particles. So we'll keep it just at that. But if you put more fructose in, not surprisingly, you produce more LDL particles. It's fairly simple for me, so if I can understand it, hopefully you guys can too. Now those LDLs are lipoproteins. Those lipoproteins are made up of lipo and protein. What lipo is? Lipid. It's made up of fat and protein in combination. And the fat that you put into an LDL particle is purely related to what you take into your mouth. So if you take a diet which is high in saturated fats, then the LDLs are going to be filled with saturated fat. If you take it with high amounts of polyunsaturated fat, you'll have more polyunsaturated fat. So quite simply, the more polyunsaturated fat you fill up those lipoproteins with, those LDL particles, the more inflammatory those particles are. So if you fill it up with a saturated fat, that's as inflammatory as a brick wall, right? Never lights up. If you fill it up with polyunsaturated fats, then you're filling up your LDL particles, your lipoproteins, the bad particles, with kindling. Right? The more kindling you put in, the more inflammatory it is. Now, where do the LDL particles go? You've all heard LDL going to go to the bad particles. What on earth does that happen to them? Well, unfortunately, they're the ones that actually sneak into our blood vessel walls. And that's where they create trouble. I found this slide to be really, really important for me in the understanding. And I call the LDLs the Goldilocks particles. They can slide along, they float along in the bloodstream. And I will use the pointer. This is the bloodstream up here. This is the blood vessel wall, and this is the outside of the blood vessel. So they float along in the circulation, and they are just the Goldilocks sized particle. You've got particles which are bigger and smaller, and the big ones float by. The HDL ones are much smaller and they slide in and out, but the LDL ones, the small dense ones, get into that blood vessel wall, and they sit there. And there's a picture there that says that they become oxidised. So if those LDLs are filled up with a polyunsaturated LDL. They become inflamed and oxidised in that layer of the blood vessel wall. Vitamin D is involved in the process of getting rid of that LDL particle and its inflammation. And I think that's a really beautiful point there, because at the times of plenty, when we normally eat fruit, and we're all as animals, and at the time we can actually eat that fruit, and we increase our fructose load to our bodies, and we increase our LDL particle load to that subintimal layer of our blood vessel walls, the one thing we need to clear that mechanism, clear that away, are cells called macrophages, which are under the direct influence of vitamin D. So guess what? In summer when we eat our fruit, the sun's up. And Mother Nature, God, whoever we believe in, actually was pretty switched on when they developed that mechanism. So I don't think we're naturally meant to have fruit or fructose all year round. And certainly in Tasmania, where I come from, in winter we have very low levels of vitamin D. Now the other thing about the cell membrane, the other spot where we have fat in our bodies is actually the cell membrane. And it's made up of a phospholipid layer. Again, that lipid word comes in, and again, the amount of fat that we've got in our cell membrane walls is purely dependent on the amount of fat that we take into our system, whether or not it's a saturated fat or a polyunsaturated fat. The trouble is, we're now increasing the amount of polyunsaturated fat within our LDL particles and in every cell membrane of the body. That means we've got more kindling making up our bodies. That equals more inflammation. That equals inflammation in the subintimal layer of every single blood vessel in every organ of the body and in every cell of every organ of the body. We're just an inflammatory mass waiting to happen. A little bit more pathophysiology. I'll come back to glucose again. This is something we came across earlier this year, and I was at a meeting in Auckland, and I slid this paper across to Grant Schofield, and I slid it across to him, and another person was speaking, and he went, "Oh, expletive," in kindness. And what we came across, we didn't actually, we should be biochemists like Kieran and understand this, but there's a thing called an endogenous production of fructose. So in our bodies, when we take in glucose, about 3% of it's converted into fructose. It's just a survival mechanism, and I won't go into that, but essentially when we take in glucose, about 3% of it gets converted into fructose and then into LDL particles. That pathway is called the polyol pathway, and one of the side arms of that side products is a thing called ROS, reactive oxygen species, which again is an inflammatory material. This is the kicker which came across my way earlier this year, based on a 1984 paper looking at cataracts. And in this group of people who are hyperglycemic, that's effectively meant those who are obese and those who are insulin resistant, and you've heard that over and over today, you don't convert 3% of your glucose into fructose, you convert 30%. There's a 10-fold increase. I think that explains the runaway train of our health issues now. So therefore, when we have carbohydrate in our diet, we're not just converting 3% of glucose into fructose, we're now converting it to 30%. That's a massive load of LDL particles. So that's my pathophysiology. Have I got any association evidence? This is not causation, it's not proof. I borrowed this from David Gillespie. In the 1970s, we increased our consumption of fructose. The blues related to sugar, the oranges related to fruit juice, high fructose corn syrup. This is US data, but the Australian one is very similar, but not high fructose corn syrup, it's just a greater sugar consumption. And the grey is the fruit juices. But in the 1970s, we had a massive increase in our fructose consumption. That means we produced more LDL particles than we used to. What happened to our carbohydrate consumption in the same time frame? Well, 1970s, where the arrow is, we've just increased it again and again. So what does that mean? Well, it produces even more LDL particles. Remember that it's not 3%, it's 30% being produced into LDLs. What happened to our polyunsaturated oil consumption? It took off. Our vegetable oils went up. This is a whole vast number of them. And as a result of that, it has increased the amount of available polyunsaturated oil in our diet. I've taken this from Stefan Guyanet, who has studied this and gone back through a lot of data. This slide is relating to the amount of omega-6 polyunsaturated fat in our body fat. So that data has been collected since the 1950s, and there's been a steady increase in the amount of polyunsaturated fat percentage in our body fat. So back in 1960, it was about 8% of our body fat was pro-inflammatory omega-6 fatty acid, linoleic acid, and it's steadily been increasing. It's up around 24% in 2010 in one study, and it's arguably getting up to around 30%. The same things happen with women's breast milk in the same time frame. French and US data suggest that in fact the linoleic acid, the pro-inflammatory omega-6 polyunsaturated component, is steadily increasing, whereas the omega-3, which is the bottom one, which is a flat line, has stayed about the same. So our bodies are now made up of more pro-inflammatory material than ever, and we're feeding our babies that as well. And we're also doing that whilst the baby's still in utero. So overall, we've got more LDL particles in our body, which are filled up with pro-inflammatory material. Our cell membranes are getting more and more pro-inflammatory material in it, and that equals more inflammation, and I think that equals modern disease. So that's my association evidence. What intervention evidence have we got? We've heard a little bit about it today. Low carb, high fat diets do reverse a whole lot of these conditions. We know that, and again we can go through multiple papers, but just for the brevity of today, low carb, high fat diets work in a variety of conditions and associated with, this is the old treatment of epilepsy, it's the old treatment of diabetes before the introduction of pharmaceuticals. We know that ketogenic diets are very useful in the management of those conditions, and we're starting to see data again. The blue zone longevity cultures have been alluded to, cultures where people live to very, very old age. And they've tried to look to see what the common factor is. Well, the common factor is not what they eat, the common factor is what they don't eat. What they don't eat is they don't have high amounts of sugar, they don't have high amounts of high processed carbohydrate, and they don't have polyunsaturated oils. They've also got a sense of community and well-being. So that is my model of modern disease. I think the combination of sugar, particularly fructose, refined carbohydrate and polyunsaturated oils, is pro-inflammatory in every cell membrane, every blood vessel wall and every organ of the body. Sure, the other stuff comes in, okay? The other stuff clearly then hits a susceptible organ, and we all vary in our genetic susceptibility to that. And that's the other stuff that I can refer to. I do think that modern food is a weapon of mass destruction. I do think that inflammation is the basis of all disease, or all modern disease. I think it's time we put out the inflammation. You keep hearing this term over and over, real food. I mean, that's the future of our eating. I think we need to go low sugar, low carbohydrate, minimise those polyunsaturated oils, and go to higher natural fats. I'm a great believer in eating locally, seasonally, and natural food. I mean, there's nothing natural about bananas in Tasmania, as I keep pointing out to people. And I was introduced to the term of eating humbly recently by a chef, and it's about actually respecting your food and respecting the distance it's had to travel, and to think about where it's come from. And that's a common theme here. I think we can start making some informed choices about our health. I recognise that I'm just part of the noise out there giving nutritional advice in society, but the more noise I make, the more likely I might be heard. And I'm not an only child, but I should have been. I do think we have a nutritional model of modern disease. I need to recognise it needs to be refined, but I think we've got the basis of it. At a sense of frustration, trying to actually help people, and this is my journey. I started by doing a handout sheet, and then I developed a website when people wanted more information. And people want that one-on-one advice. So we're now opening up, not tomorrow, Rod, but on Monday, a Nutrition for Life Centre, Diabetes and Health Research Centre, which I'm very privileged to have several people come my path in recent times particularly Britt, who's here today, is our senior dietitian who has crossed over to the dark side. I am heartened that in the last 6 weeks I'm aware of 6 dietitians who have come to me saying they're struggling to continue to promote their association's guidelines. Some have got some interest in working with me. I would love to liaise with others who feel it's difficult to come out and work against their association's guidelines. Very open to just introduce you to other people. If there are dietitians here today, if you know dietitians, I'm very, very happy to sort of link you up so you're not alone, because this is an issue that I felt alone when I started talking. Met Rod. Rod introduced me, and now I've got a network of people around the world who have helped me and given me support as well. So we've got this process underway. I'm hoping it's going to be successful. If we get the business model right, then we can actually continue it on and help a lot more people. I do use social media. I recognise it's a pathway to try and get this message out there. And I thank my wife for actually introducing me / forcing me down that path. And I can be contacted on all of these forums. So thank you very much, and good luck for the rest of the afternoon.